Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Thursday, January 29th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 77.1 degrees, with a low of 55.4, so expect a mild winter day perfect for getting out and about. Coming up, we'll examine the reasons behind the FBI's recent raid on Georgia's 2020 election documents after all these years, and uncover why many caregivers are facing the loss of key federal wage safeguards. Plus, we'll cover other important stories from around the nation and the world. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. Our top story this morning is the surprise FBI raid on Fulton County's main elections warehouse just south of Atlanta. Reporter Ethan Cole is with us. Ethan, what exactly did federal agents do out there yesterday?
Grace, according to ABC News and local Atlanta coverage, agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation showed up early yesterday, January 28th, at Fulton County's Election Hub and Operations Center in Union City. That is a huge, roughly 600,000 square foot warehouse that stores the county's election materials. They executed a court-approved search warrant and hauled away around 700 boxes tied to the 2020 presidential election, including paper ballots, tabulator tapes, digital ballot images, and even unredacted voter rolls. An FBI spokesperson, Jenna Solito, described it only as a, quote, law enforcement action, end quote, and would not say more because the investigation is ongoing.
700 boxes of old election records is a lot. Why is this so significant, especially almost 6 years after that election?
It is the timing and the target that make this explosive. Fulton County is Georgia's largest, heavily Democratic, and it is where Joe Biden's narrow win in Georgia was cemented back in 2020. Donald Trump has attacked this county over and over, claiming fraud without proof, even after multiple recounts and audits confirmed Biden's margin of about 11,779 votes. The Guardian notes that raiding a local elections office this many years after certification is virtually unheard of and immediately raises questions about election integrity, federal overreach, and the politicization of law enforcement under Trump-appointed FBI Director Kash Patel.
So what do investigators say they are actually looking for in those boxes?
The warrant, signed by Magistrate Judge Catherine Salinas in the Northern District of Georgia, cites possible violations of federal election law, including 2 sections of Title 52 of the United States Code. 1, Section 20.511, focuses on knowingly procuring fraudulent ballots or otherwise corrupting a fair election process. Another, Section 2702, makes it a crime to steal, destroy, conceal, or alter federal election records. Even though federal law only requires those records to be kept for 22 months after an election, the Justice Department argues, according to ProPublica, that is just a minimum retention period, not a deadline that blocks later criminal investigations, and that its broader search authority under Rule 41 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure still applies as long as the records exist.
And Ethan, there is also some controversy over who is running this investigation and how far the Justice Department is reaching, right?
That is right. The warrant paperwork, according to CBS News, lists interim United States Attorney Thomas Albus from the Eastern District of Missouri as the lead prosecutor, even though this all happened in Georgia. Legal analysts told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that bringing in a prosecutor from Missouri with no obvious tie to Fulton County is highly unusual and feeds the perception of a hand-picked team aligned with Trump's priorities. At the same time, critics point to Kash Patel's tenure at the FBI and Trump's own public promises of, quote, retribution, end quote, as signs this is less about neutral law enforcement and more about revisiting 2020 in ways that benefit the current White House.
Let's talk about the scene in that warehouse. What did it look like as agents carried this out?
Reporters from ABC News and The Guardian describe a tense, almost cinematic atmosphere. Agents, some in tactical gear, put up yellow tape around the facility and spent hours loading those sealed boxes into plain white trucks. Fulton County Commissioner Mo Ivory went on Instagram Live from inside, saying the first version of the warrant had legal problems, which forced agents to pause while Judge Salinas issued a corrected document. While that played out, County Chairman Rob Pitts and lawyers huddled in the building, scrambling to figure out how or whether they could push back in real time.
And these records, Ethan, were under state seal before agents walked in, correct?
Yes, and that is one of the core points of conflict. Che Alexander, the clerk of Superior and Magistrate Courts, is the legal custodian of those 2020 records under Georgia law, and she has argued for months that they can only be accessed if a state judge agrees to unseal them. She told reporters, including those at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, that the ballots and related materials were stored securely in that warehouse, under court-ordered seals, and that even county officials could not just pull them off the shelf. Her position has been that the federal government needed to go through Georgia courts, not around them, with a surprise search warrant.
Help us connect the dots. How did we get from the 2020 vote count to agents seizing ballots nearly 6 years later?
The roots go back to Trump's pressure campaign right after the election. In that now famous January 2021 phone call, reported by the Washington Post and others, Trump pressed Georgia's Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to, quote, find 11,780 votes, end quote, which would have flipped the outcome. Over 60 court cases, several recounts, and investigations by both state officials and Trump's own Attorney General William Barr all found no evidence of outcome-changing fraud. Yet false claims, like the debunked story that Fulton workers pulled mysterious suitcases of ballots from under a table, continued to circulate, and The Guardian notes those lies ultimately cost Rudy Giuliani a defamation judgment of roughly $148 million in favor of 2 poll workers he falsely accused.
Then there was that big racketeering case from Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. Where does that fit into this timeline?
In August 2023, Willis charged Trump and 18 allies with 41 counts under Georgia's racketeering law, alleging a conspiracy to overturn the state's election results. That case was widely seen as one of the most serious legal threats Trump faced, but in November 2025, courts threw it out after finding an appearance of impropriety because Willis had a romantic relationship with a special prosecutor she had hired. NBC affiliates, drawing on Associated Press reporting, note that dismissal outraged many Democrats and voting rights advocates who saw it as a technicality that sank an important accountability effort. Trump and his allies, though, quickly cast it as proof the whole fraud narrative was legitimate and unfinished, which set the stage for new avenues of inquiry like this federal push.
Meanwhile, Georgia's state election board changed after the midterms. How did that board help set up this raid?
After a power shift in 2024, conservatives gained a 3-member majority on the 5-person state election board. According to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and Once Constitution and 2020 BOR, that new majority reopened long-dormant questions about Fulton's handling of 2020, issuing subpoenas in late 2024 and again on October 6, 2025, for used and void ballots, ballot stubs, signature envelopes, and digital files. Fulton County officials, backed by Alexander, resisted, saying state law locked those materials under court seal and they could not simply hand them to an administrative board. The standoff escalated when the board formally asked the United States Attorney General to help them pry open those records, effectively inviting federal involvement.
And the Justice Department first tried a civil route before going to a criminal warrant, right?
That is right, and it is important. On October 30th, 2025, the department sent Alexander a letter invoking the Civil Rights Act, demanding access and hinting that blocking them could violate federal law, according to ProPublica's reconstruction of the timeline. When she did not comply, DOJ sued her on November 21st, then refiled a similar civil case in December, arguing that withheld access was obstructing federal voting rights oversight. Alexander moved to dismiss, pointing to the expired 22-month record retention period and the state court seal, and in mid-January of this year, a federal judge tossed the civil case on jurisdictional grounds. Within days, the Justice Department shifted gears and obtained this criminal search warrant instead, using its Rule 41 authority to seize the records directly.
There were also some quieter personnel moves at the FBI before this all happened. What do we know there?
ABC News reports that in early January, the Bureau quietly replaced the head of its Atlanta field office, Paul Brown, citing only unspecified personnel reasons. That change drew little attention at the time, but it now looks like part of a broader reshuffling ahead of more aggressive moves on Trump-era grievances. The raid then came just a week after Trump addressed the World Economic Forum in Davos on January 21st, where he told the crowd, quote, "People will soon be prosecuted for what they did in 2020, end quote, without naming names. To critics, including democracy advocates quoted by NPR, the proximity of that speech to this action makes it hard to see the raid as insulated from presidential pressure.
Let's bring this back to Fulton County's response. What are local officials doing right now to fight this?
Fulton County leaders are moving fast. CBS News and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution report that county lawyers are preparing an emergency motion in federal court to either quash the warrant altogether or at least halt any review of the seized records. They argue the search was an unreasonable seizure under the Fourth Amendment because it relied on old, already debunked allegations rather than new evidence, including claims about unsigned tabulation tapes for more than 300,000 votes that state investigators had previously chalked up to sloppy paperwork. Those earlier reviews, including a 2024 reprimand from the state election board itself, criticized Fulton's management, but explicitly stopped short of finding intentional fraud.
And beyond Fulton, Ethan, what are the bigger constitutional questions that legal experts are pointing to?
This raid hits a fault line between state control of elections and federal power to enforce voting laws. Critics, including some conservative legal scholars quoted by Democracy Docket, point to the Elections Clause in the 10th Amendment, arguing that once Georgia certified its results and completed multiple recounts, Washington has no business physically seizing ballots years later. The Justice Department leans on the Supremacy Clause to say its criminal authority trumps state seals, but opponents say the warrant is too broad, asking for essentially all 2020 materials, and veering into what the founders would have called a general warrant. There is also a very practical concern about chain of custody. Democratic State Senator Josh McLaurin, who is running for lieutenant governor, warned that moving ballots into federal hands creates opportunities for tampering or simple error that could make any future review less trustworthy.
How are Georgia's top Democrats, especially those who represent Fulton County, talking about this to voters?
They're leaning into the idea that this is about punishing a blue county for voting the wrong way. Senator John Ossoff, who is on the ballot again this year, called it a, quote, sore loser's crusade, end quote, tying the raid to Trump's use of the Justice Department and his role in inciting the January 6th Capitol attack, according to The Guardian and PBS. Senator Raphael Warnock said federal agents were being used for, quote, political errands, end quote, not impartial justice. And former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms warned that what happens to Fulton now could become a, quote, blueprint, end quote, for targeting Democratic strongholds nationwide, further eroding trust in how votes are counted.
We also saw some very high-profile national security figures at the warehouse. Why is that raising additional concerns?
Reuters photos cited by CBS and Al Jazeera showed Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard and Deputy FBI Director Andrew Bailey on site during the operation. A senior administration official said Gabbard was there because she leads a 2025 task force on election interference and needs to oversee the security of voting systems. But former intelligence officials quoted by CBS called it unprecedented for a DNI, whose job is foreign threats, to be physically present at a domestic law enforcement raid on ballots. They say it blurs the line between intelligence gathering and criminal investigation in a way that could chill local election officials who now see not just FBI agents, but top intelligence brass at their storage rooms.
Let's zoom out. What are democracy watchdogs and voting rights groups saying about the long-term impact of all this?
The Carter Center, which is based in Atlanta and has monitored elections around the world, issued a statement saying it was, quote, deeply concerned, end quote, about what it called an unprecedented post-certification seizure of ballots, warning that it risks sowing confusion before the 2026 midterms. The group All Voting is Local told The Guardian it fears this will become a template for partisan actors to use federal tools to grab ballots in counties they do not control. Outlets like WABE and Democracy Docket emphasize there is no modern precedent for federal agents carting away ballots this long after the statutory retention period. Aside from civil rights-era cases in the 1960s that were focused on stopping active discrimination and were filed within the legal window. To many of these groups, that historical comparison underscores how different and more political this latest move appears.
From a purely legal standpoint, though, how strong is the Justice Department's argument for acting now?
Officials at DOJ say their authority flows from that same section, 200511 of Title 52, which criminalizes election fraud without any built-in expiration date. They point to older cases, like a 1993 decision involving the Board of Supervisors in Forest County, Mississippi, where federal courts signed off on seizing records to enforce voting rights laws, even over local objections. But election law expert Rick Hasen at UCLA told ProPublica that those cases involved relatively prompt civil rights enforcement, not relitigating an election years after recounts and court challenges mostly went against Trump. Analysts at the Brennan Center, cited in congressional reports, warned that unless prosecutors can show genuinely new, concrete evidence of fraud, judges may see this as a politically driven fishing expedition and could suppress any evidence or even throw out future charges.
Finally, Ethan, what should listeners watch for over the next few days as this story develops?
The immediate thing is the legal fight over the warrant itself. Fulton County's emergency motion, expected by the end of this week, will ask a federal judge to freeze any review of the seized materials and to decide whether the government overstepped by going after virtually all of Fulton's 2020 records at once. At the same time, according to NPR and regional outlets like the Durango Herald, this raid is already deepening mistrust between state and federal officials and hardening partisan narratives about stolen elections versus political revenge. Whatever courts ultimately rule about the legality of the search, the fact that federal agents just drove off with hundreds of boxes of old ballots from Georgia's bluest county is likely to hang over every election conversation between now and November.
A lot of layers there, and it is moving fast. Ethan Cole, thanks for breaking it all down for us. We are turning now to a big shift in how our country pays and staffs the people who care for older and disabled Americans. Reporter Chloe Ngue is with us to unpack what has changed for caregivers as of today, Thursday, January 29th, 2026. Chloe, give us the big picture first. What exactly has the federal government rolled back?
The short answer is, federal protections for caregivers have been pulled way back, both in people's homes and in nursing homes. According to NPR and analyses from the Economic Policy Institute, the Trump administration's Labor Department has effectively dismantled Obama and Biden-era rules that guaranteed federal minimum wage and overtime to millions of home care workers. On top of that, the administration has rolled back national staffing requirements in federally funded nursing homes that were finalized under President Biden. Put together, advocates say it is one of the biggest reversals in labor and health policy in decades, right as the population rapidly ages.
How did we get to this point? Care work has been treated differently under federal labor law for a long time, right?
It has, and that history really matters. The Fair Labor Standards Act, passed back in 1938, created the federal minimum wage and overtime, but it deliberately left out domestic workers to keep support from Southern lawmakers, as the ACLU and the legal blog on labor.org have documented. That workforce was largely Black women and immigrants doing household and care work, and it was labeled as non-essential, so those jobs never got the same baseline protections. In 1974, Congress added some protections for domestic workers, but the Labor Department then wrote a very broad companionship services exemption in 1975 that let agencies call professional home care aides companions and avoid paying minimum wage or overtime.
So what did the Obama administration do to change that, and how many workers were affected?
The turning point came with the Home Care Final Rule in 2013, which took effect in late 2015. The Obama Labor Department narrowed that companionship loophole so that most agency-employed home care workers doing real hands-on care were finally covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, with a cap on how much time they could spend on incidental housekeeping. NPR and PHI, the Paraprofessional Healthcare Institute, report that more than 2 to almost 4 million workers gained federal minimum wage and overtime protections through that change. GAO and PHI later found that since the rule took effect, workers recovered nearly $158 million in back wages through complaints, and compliance improved in an industry that had chronically high turnover.
And what has the Trump administration done over the past year to undo that rule?
The process started last summer. In July 2025, the Labor Department issued a proposed rule to essentially go back to the 1975 framework and restore the broad companionship exemption, according to coverage from onlabor.org and the Economic Policy Institute. But even before that rulemaking could finish, the Wage and Hour Division put out a field assistance bulletin on July 25, 2025, telling staff to stop enforcing the Obama rule, which NPR described as a de facto rollback. That enforcement freeze signaled to home care agencies that they could reclassify aides as exempt companions again, meaning no federal obligation to pay minimum wage or overtime to roughly 3.7 million home care and hospice workers.
You mentioned nursing homes too. What changed there toward the end of last year?
In nursing homes, the rollback focused on staffing. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services under President Biden had finalized staffing rules on April 22, 2024, requiring Medicare and Medicaid facilities to provide at least 3.48 hours of staff time per resident per day, including a registered nurse on duty around the clock. Houston Style magazine reports those rules came out of Biden's 2022 nursing home reform plan and a 2023 executive order to tackle chronic understaffing that was tied to neglect and safety problems. But after private meetings in August 2025 between President Trump and nursing home executives, the Justice Department stopped defending those rules in court, and on December 3, 2025, CMS issued an interim final rule that rescinded the staffing mandates, going back to much more flexible, facility-defined standards.
There is also a big Medicaid piece here. How did that factor into the rollbacks?
Funding pressures were a major backdrop. In July 2025, the president signed House Bill 1, nicknamed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which cut federal Medicaid spending by about $1 trillion over 10 years, or roughly 15%, according to EPI and state budget summaries from Pennsylvania. Medicaid is the largest payer for nursing homes and a key source of funding for home and community-based services for low-income seniors and disabled people. Those states are not required to cover all those services. With less federal money coming in, especially in southern states, policymakers and industry groups argued they needed relief from wage rules and staffing mandates so facilities and agencies would not go under.
Let's talk about those arguments. What do the administration and industry leaders say these rollbacks are supposed to fix?
The Home Care Association of America, which has now merged into the National Alliance for Care at Home, says the Obama rule backfired on workers and clients. Their legislative director, Cheryl Stanton, who previously held a senior post at the Trump Labor Department, told NPR that once overtime applied, many agencies capped caregivers at 40 hours a week instead of letting them work 60 or 70 hours with one family. They argue that split people's schedules across multiple clients hurt relationships and pushed up recruitment costs, and they point to a roughly 30% drop in small mom-and-pop agencies since 2013. For nursing homes, Houston Style magazine reports executives warned that the Biden staffing standards would be too rigid and expensive for multi-state chains and private equity owners, forcing closures, especially in rural areas.
And how do worker advocates and health economists respond to that case?
They see it very differently. PHI's research director, Kezia Scales, told NPR the rollback strips away hard-won rights and ignores evidence that those protections made these jobs more stable, with more full-time roles and nearly $158 million in back wages recovered. A Government Accountability Office report from 2020, GAO 21-72, reviewed the early years of the Obama rule and found no broad drop in earnings. Instead, the home care industry added about 200,000 jobs from 2013 through 2019, even as demand rose about 25%. Economists like Amanda Kreider at the University of Pittsburgh, cited in NPR and University of Pennsylvania studies, say the real constraint is that base pay is so low and burnout is so high that people leave the field, and that cutting overtime and Medicaid at the same time will only worsen shortages.
What are we seeing already in terms of paychecks and turnover for home care workers, especially in states that lean on the federal minimum?
Early data show a clear hit in states that simply follow federal rules, like Texas, Florida, and Mississippi. PHI estimates median annual earnings for home care workers in those states are stuck around $21,889, with a competitive wage gap of more than $5 an hour compared to other entry-level jobs like retail or warehousing. The National Domestic Workers Alliance, in a 2025 survey called The Price of Companionship, found about 65% of agencies they looked at in Florida and Mississippi had rejiggered schedules to eliminate overtime as soon as enforcement stopped. Advocates warned that in a field where turnover was already around 80% a year, per PHI, losing overtime and seeing stagnant pay will push even more workers out.
How is this playing out inside nursing homes now that the federal staffing floor has been removed?
Patient safety groups are deeply concerned. Houston Style magazine spoke with advocates who say that, without a clear national minimum, chronically understaffed facilities are more likely to miss medications, delay help with toileting or turning residents in bed, and see higher rates of infections and pressure ulcers. A joint analysis last summer by the National Institutes of Health and the Kaiser Family Foundation found that understaffed homes were roughly 14% more likely to have serious health and safety deficiencies. While the American Healthcare Association, the main nursing home trade group, credits the new flexibility with helping add more than 40,000 nursing jobs in 2025, groups like Consumer Voice argue that many of those jobs are at the lowest levels and do not guarantee enough staff on the floor at any given moment.
It sounds like where you live now matters more than ever. How divided are states in how they treat caregivers after these federal changes?
It has become a patchwork. About 24 states, including California, New York, Washington, Illinois, Massachusetts, Oregon, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Colorado, Connecticut, Michigan, and Minnesota, have formed what Pennsylvania officials describe as a protective coalition, choosing to keep or strengthen wage and staffing standards despite the federal rollback. California wrote Obama-style overtime protection for home care into state law last September, and New York raised home care wages in New York City, Long Island, and Westchester County to just under $20 an hour this January. In those higher standard states, AHCA data show caregiver turnover has dropped to the low 40% range, and NIH and KFF report that nursing homes with robust staffing rules tend to earn higher quality ratings.
And what about states that are sticking to the weaker federal baseline, or even trimming back?
In much of the South and parts of the West, states have largely followed the federal lead. Places like Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arizona, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Oklahoma still have home care wages that hover under $12 an hour, according to PHI, even as other entry-level jobs climb higher. AHCA's own reports show turnover in those states approaching 80% in some years, and regulators cite more deficiencies tied to understaffing and rushed care. Analysts at the Economic Policy Institute estimate that nationally, the rollback shifts about $947 million each year away from workers and into agency margins and Medicaid savings, with the harshest impact in those baseline states.
With stakes that high, I imagine there are court battles. What is happening legally right now?
The biggest case is a multi-state lawsuit called Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and Others versus the U.S. Department of Labor, filed late last year in federal court in Philadelphia. 19 Democratic attorneys general, including those from California, New York, and Massachusetts, argue that the Labor Department's July 2025 enforcement bulletin is arbitrary and capricious under the Administrative Procedure Act because it guts a major rule without going through full public notice and comment. A judge declined to issue a nationwide stay back in December, but did order the department to turn over internal records, and a key hearing on a preliminary injunction is scheduled for February 15, 2026, just a couple of weeks from now. Groups like SEIU 775, the ACLU, and the National Domestic Workers Alliance have filed briefs backing the states, calling the rollback a revival of discriminatory exclusions that date back to the 1930s.
Is Congress doing anything in parallel, or is this mostly playing out in the courts and state capitals?
There is at least one significant effort on Capitol Hill. Democratic Representative Pramila Jayapal has introduced a bill with support from more than 100 co-sponsors that would write the 2013 home care protections directly into federal law so a future administration could not undo them as easily through regulation. According to House records and coverage on NPR, the bill would essentially codify minimum wage and overtime coverage for most home care workers nationwide, while nudging states to improve Medicaid reimbursement so agencies can afford to pay. For now, it faces long odds in the current Congress, so the courtroom and state-by-state battles are carrying most of the weight.
All these numbers can feel abstract. Can you put a human face on what this means for someone doing the work?
NPR recently profiled a 63-year-old caregiver in New York named Marilyn Blackett, who has worked in home care for decades. Even in a relatively protective state with higher local wage floors, she earns under $20 an hour for physically and emotionally demanding work, like lifting clients, helping with bathing and toileting, and managing medications. She told NPR, quote, "This is a job, and we have to be recognized as workers," end quote, explaining that even a few lost overtime hours can mean choosing between rent and utilities. Advocates say her story is common across the country, and that in states without extra protections, workers are even more exposed as federal enforcement pulls back.
Before we let you go, what do experts say this all means for the future as more Americans age into needing care?
PHI projects that the country will need hundreds of thousands of new direct care workers over the next decade as baby boomers move into their 80s, and the National Consumer Voice warns we are sliding into a two-tier system. In wealthier areas or strong protection states, families may see more stable caregivers and safer nursing homes, while in poorer or deregulated regions, people may face constant turnover, fewer home care options, and more facility problems. Researchers at the Economic Policy Institute and GAO stress that without a sustainable workforce, Medicaid savings today could mean higher costs later from hospitalizations and emergencies tied to inadequate care. They also note that this is a heavily female and disproportionately Black and brown workforce, so these policy choices are amplifying existing inequalities.
A lot to watch in the months ahead. Reporter Chloe Nguyen walking us through the rollback of caregiver wage and staffing protections and what it means right now. Chloe, thank you. Here are some other headlines. The cost of calling in the cavalry is climbing fast. A new report from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says domestic National Guard deployments could top $1.1 billion this year if they march on at the current tempo. Between June and December 2025, the Trump administration spent about $496 million, with the meter now ticking near $93 million a month. Though missions in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Portland have packed up, troops remain in Washington, D.C., Memphis, and New Orleans. The capital's deployment alone is on track to hit roughly $660 million by the end of 2026. The White House hails the missions as a highly successful crime-fighting surge, while Senator Jeff Merkley and other Democrats blast them as a massive waste of national treasure and a budgetary draft on training and readiness. Across the globe, diplomacy is going from cold storage to hot property. In Beijing, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Chinese President Xi Jinping have sealed what they call a long-term, stable, and comprehensive strategic partnership, officially ending years of a diplomatic ice age. Xi says he will actively consider unilateral visa-free entry for British travelers, while both sides ink a raft of trade and services deals, highlighted by a $15 billion investment pledge from drug giant AstraZeneca. A new security accord will share intelligence and curb Chinese-made engines used by human smuggling gangs, sending boats across the English Channel. Starmer, the first British leader to visit China since 2018, heads next to Shanghai with a 60-member business delegation before continuing his regional roadshow to Japan. Back home, immigration enforcement is in the legal hot seat. In federal court in Fort Myers, former detainees at Florida's Alligator Alcatraz facility testified their calls to lawyers were repeatedly dropped and that they were punished for seeking counsel. A class action lawsuit in Minnesota alleges detainees at the Bishop Henry Whipple building are being pressured to waive their rights, while members of Congress say they were blocked from oversight visits, leaving some people held for days without attorneys or even basic hygiene. The cases target ICE's Operation Metro Surge and Operation Paris, with critics arguing due process has been deported. A federal judge has ordered acting ICE Director Todd Lyons to appear in court on January 30th, a hearing that could rewrite the rulebook on oversight and the rights of lawfully present refugees caught in recent sweeps. On the food safety front, the ByHeart baby formula botulism outbreak now has a milk mustache of evidence. Investigators have traced the contamination to dried organic whole milk powder supplied by Organic West Milk Inc. and processed at a Dairy Farmers of America plant in Fallon, Nevada. The FDA says that powder tested positive for Clostridium botulinum type A, genetically matching bacteria found in finished formula and in sick infants. Since late 2023, 51 babies across 19 states have been hospitalized, most after August 2025. Organic West has halted sales of the implicated powder and says it does not supply that ingredient to other formula makers, while regulators probe every step from farm to formula and question why retailers like Walmart and Target were slow to pull recalled cans from shelves. And in environmental news, some states may soon be clearing the air on their own terms, while neighbors hold their breath. The Environmental Protection Agency has proposed rolling back the Biden-era Good Neighbor Plan, a rule meant to limit smokestack emissions that drift across state lines. The agency now wants to approve ozone plans for Alabama, Arizona, Kentucky, Minnesota, Mississippi, Nevada, New Mexico, and Tennessee, reversing earlier federal disapprovals. Administrator Lee Zeldin casts it as cooperative federalism, but health advocates warn that what's legal in one state's power plant could be lethal downwind, with more smog, more asthma, and more premature deaths. The proposal heads into public comment, potentially exempting those 8 states from the tougher federal standard, and leaving millions to see which way the political wind really blows. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.